Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Josh and today we're going to dive into a project that was long overdue but totally unplanned. A workshop renovation that became a necessity in the aftermath of a recent flood. So join me as we turn an old workspace into something that is way more practical and just a nicer space to be in. So on the 18th of December, we woke up to Cyclone Jasper that dumped a heap of water right outside our front door. Now, looking at this, I immediately knew that I would have at least a foot of water inside my workshop. And sure enough, there's my foot and there is the water. Luckily though, the previous night around 11, I decided to run back inside and just try and lift up as much as I could off the ground. Anything I could get my hands on. Even these machines are lifted 4 inches off the ground already. It didn't make much of a difference, but I was very hopeful that this would be the worst of it. By 11:30 a.m. that morning, we had 1.3 meters of water inside my workshop. At that point, there was nothing more I could do but close the door and just wait. Fortunately for us, the water only stayed up for a couple of hours, and 2 days later it subsided enough for me to get back into my workshop and start cleaning out. By midday, I cleared out everything that was water damaged, roughly 2.5 trailer loads worth, and by the end of the day, I cleaned the floors, and this is pretty much what I had left. So this is what it looks like after about 7 days, 8 days now of drying time. So you can see I've removed some of the panels on the walls just to get some airflow through. And yeah, so now it's putting everything back together again. The very first thing I want to do is paint these floors. And this is something I wanted to do for a very long time. And the color I'm going for is this gray, and it's actually called Crazy Gray. While I'm at it, I'm just going to add this top coat grip additive. It's not really necessary for my floors because they are very rough, but I'm just doing this once, so might as well. So for the first coat, they recommend you water this down with mineral turpentine just to make it a bit more runny. So I'm doing that, and I'm adding this top coat grip additive as well. From there, I'm just cutting in with a brush all along the outside edges just to make it easier when you come around with a roller. And the nice part about this job is it doesn't actually matter if you accidentally spill a few drops here and there, because you're going to paint over it anyway. And for the big space in between, we just use a roller on a stick, and the difficult part, if you could call it that, is making sure that the paint actually covers any imperfections in your floor where you got little dips and things like that. So pretty straightforward. And then 2 coats later, this is what your floor will look like. After that, we're going to do a clear sealer on top. And it's pretty much the same procedure as before, going all around the edges with a brush first. The tricky part about this part of the job is that the top coat is actually clear like water. So that makes it a little bit difficult to see exactly where you've painted. And I did manage to step in it once or twice, so not a big deal, but just something to note. As with all renovations of this kind, there's always something that needs to change halfway through. And in this case, I need to change this cabinet. So I'm actually quite surprised that this is in the condition that it is, considering that it's been underwater for a couple of hours. Still usable, so we're keeping it. But I want to remove this one on the end to make the whole thing shorter. And then I also want to swap around these two. And you'll see why all of this is important in just a bit. Now, this is what it looks like when it's done. And I must say, I'm pretty happy with how this floor turned out. It really makes such a big difference just to how the whole place feels. Dust collection, that's something that I really need to get upgraded in my workshop, and for that I got this 2-stage dust collector from Carbotech, and it came in a big crate like this, and it also had a few boxes with obvious bits and pieces like the frame. Most of the unit comes pre-assembled like this, which makes it really simple and easy to put together. And of course you got the normal bits and pieces that you would normally expect with a machine like this, your coasters, some nuts and bolts, the plastic bags that goes in the bin, and there's a clamp to hold that in place, which is a quick release type clamp. Then you got a remote, which is really nice, some more bits and pieces, handles, that kind of thing, and of course your instruction manual. And just in case you're curious, this is a 1.5 kilowatt or 2 horsepower motor. It can move 853 cubic feet per minute, which for this size workshop is pretty decent, I reckon. As far as assembly goes, it is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is attach all your coasters to the bottom of the frame and the bin, and then you just assemble your frame. Now, when it comes to the main impeller housing, this part is important. It says, the main impeller housing is heavy and will require a total of 3 people to complete this final assembly. All of this is totally doable by yourself, although it would help if you did have an extra pair of hands, even if it's just to get those bolts into place finger tight. And by the way, I'm more than happy to do another video for you on this dust separator. If you do want to see anything in particular, just let me know in the comments. Upgrading my dust collection is something that I've been meaning to do for quite some time now. For the most part of it, I've been pretty happy with the Festool shop vac that I've been using, but it does have its downsides. First of all, it's not very efficient at moving big chunks of material like wood chips. If you do compare the hoses on these, one is 4 inches and the other one is basically a straw. So it gets clogged pretty easily, and quite often you don't know that it's clogged, and you are left with dust in the air and settling everywhere, which obviously is not very good to breathe in. So hopefully with this new dust collector, this will be something that probably won't be eliminated completely, but it will at least be a very big improvement. On the side of the machine, there's a port that connects to a hose, and that goes down to the bin, and it basically keeps the plastic bag on the inside in place while the machine is running, which I reckon is pretty neat. The lid also uses these adjustable quick release clamps, which is easy to adjust so you can get an airtight seal on it. Overall, I'm quite pleased with how little floor space this unit actually takes up for what it is. And I also love the fact that it does come with a remote, which would definitely make it a bit more convenient to use if I do not lose it or something. Next, we're going to do new shelving, workbenches, and a desk. So we're going to repurpose 2 existing shelving units, and we're going to convert one of them into a desk for this corner, and then the other one is going to be for storage, and that's going to go right next to it on this side. But first though, we need to do some double handling and move everything off the CNC machine onto this shelving unit to make space for the 2 new shelving units that we're going to build and convert into workbenches and storage space. I have actually considered building these out of timber myself, but to be honest, with the cost of materials and the time and effort it takes just to do so, I mean, it's almost a no-brainer just buying these things in flat pack. They are so easy and quick to put together, and in next to no time you've got units that are probably going to last for pretty much forever. Also, what's great about these shelving units is the fact that you can quickly and easily change the height of each shelf as you need, or you can add and remove shelves as needed. For the bench tops, I just bought a big sheet of form ply, ripped it in half and just cut those to length, and that's pretty much it. On the back side of it, I attached another piece, and that's just to keep things from falling off the back, like pencils and screws and tools and stuff like that. And then I just screwed the whole thing together with some Tech screws. On the front, I'll do pretty much the same thing, but I fixed a strip of ply to the frame itself using the Tech screws, and then I'll drill through the top of the bench top to countersink the holes before screwing that down. That way I get a perfect fit over the frame / shelf, plus the bench top is then pulled down flush onto the frame. One thing I will note here is that I might end up putting something more durable on the top if needed. Maybe a sheet of composite aluminium panel, for example, just because I'm not 100% sure yet how this surface will hold up, but we'll see in time. Now, one thing that's always good to have is proper lighting, and for that I'm going to use these 40-watt LED light battens. If you take the covers off these lights, you'll find a small switch on the inside that allow you to choose one of 3 color temperatures. I'm going to mount these on the underside of the top shelf right above the work area using the same Tech screws, just a bit shorter. And just look what a difference this makes having these lights right above your workbench. You might have noticed that my workshop does not have any windows, which means the light in here is pretty bad. That might be a bit hard to see since my camera compensates for the low light, but to fix that, I'm going to add 2 additional lights to the roof. Since these are pre-wired, it's a relatively quick and easy job to do as well, and before you know it, problem solved. Back to the west wing of my workshop, and we're going to do exactly the same thing for the workbench, except in this case I'm using 16mm ply, and I'm also going to take off that sharp edge on the top front of it. And then we're just going to sand it down a little bit, just to take off all the little rough edges. And we're also going to seal this with a clear coat polyurethane just to make it last and look nicer for longer. While we leave this to dry, we're going to head over to the CNC and start rebuilding the water damaged torsion box. Now again, this is pretty hard to see on camera, but the whole thing twisted and warped as it got wet underneath. And as you can see here, it's got some moldy spots as well. So pretty much the whole thing needs to be taken apart. Now don't laugh when you see what this thing looks like underneath. This was the very first torsion box that I ever built, and it did pretty well for what it was. To give you an idea of just how much this thing bent and twisted, just take a look at this. Now there's no way you could use this again. Now that the old torsion box is gone, we are left with an opportunity to build something better. First, we're going to remove this part of the frame, and the new box will line up level with the top. Flipping it over, you will notice that the leg in the middle is actually not in the middle. I wanted to add some drawers and shelf to this narrow side, but obviously that never happened. So we might as well move that back to the middle, which should overall offer more rigidity and support for the torsion box. Also, I hate wasting materials, so anything that's still salvageable from this old torsion box, I'm going to use on this one. And one last thing, I'm not going to use any MDF on this build. I'm going to speed this up just a little bit, but this is basically where I move the 2 off-center legs to the middle of the bench and then just start building on the torsion box. As I'm building this, I'm checking to make sure everything is perfectly lined up, square, level, flat, you name it. And comparing the old one to the new one, this thing is solid. It is dead flat, no matter which way you whack that level on it. As I just mentioned, we're not going to do any MDF on this build. I'm sticking to 16mm thick plywood. And after it's all secured and fixed to the torsion box, I'm just going to go around again with the trim router just to take away that sharp edge, sand it down, and then seal it with 2 coats of polyurethane. Next up, we need to mount all the hardware again. And again on this one, I think I'm going to mount it slightly towards the right-hand side of the table, and that just leaves some space on the left-hand side, which is really handy to have. It really isn't that hard to square up the CNC as long as you think it through and you don't rush it. Here I'm using a punch to mark the location of each hole instead of trying to drill them with the CNC in place. If you don't, you might end up moving it a fraction and it will not be symmetrical anymore. Every now and then I like to do some maintenance and make sure things are still running smoothly as they should. And one of the items on my tick list is to open up this little black box and just blow out the dust that accumulates inside. After that, we are good to mount it on the underside of the bench, and then we're going to mark out where all the cables need to go through from the top down to the bottom and back into the controller. When that's all done, we can plug everything back in again, and fingers crossed, this thing starts up and it works exactly the way it should. Up to this point, I have not actually turned this on to check yet, but there was a lot of moisture and water in this workshop, so who knows. And thank goodness it works. This is also the first time that I will be using T-tracks. In the past, I managed to get by without them by simply using double-sided tape or sometimes just screwing directly down into the spoil board. But it's not always practical when you do signs with a live edge, for example. Those are usually quite big and harder to secure, so hopefully this will make things a lot easier going forward. I'm going to cut a rabbet on the edge of each board using a rabbet bit like this one so that it can overlap the edge of the T-track on both sides to provide downforce to hold it in place. And it's going to look something like this. So these two edges simply push down onto the sides of the T-tracks once screwed down, which, as I mentioned, provides additional support so you don't accidentally dislodge the track if you tighten these clamps too much. To secure the individual boards to the bench, I just mark the location for the holes, countersink them, and then screw them down. Even though this bench is perfectly flat, I'm still going to resurface this with the CNC and then add a grid, which is really handy to quickly line up stock. I already made 2 5-minute videos on how to do both of these, which I will link down in the description. And with that, my CNC is up and running again. Up next, I need to replace these extraction fans on my CO2 laser, and unfortunately they don't do very well as water features, plus they were very noisy as well. And this is what we are replacing them with. These are 8-inch inline fans from AC Infinity, and they are way more efficient at moving the same volume of air through a much larger 8-inch diameter compared to the old fans. Plus, they can do so at lower speeds, which makes them much quieter. For a start, the previous fans used much smaller diameter hoses, which means I need to enlarge the hole in the wall to accommodate the new 8-inch size hoses. I also need to build a simple stand of some sort to hold the fans in place so that the hoses have a pretty much straight run from the machine all the way to the outside. This is what it looks like when it's done, and as you can see, the actual fan can be removed if you ever need to clean it or something, and they simply just slot back in place like this, and then you just tighten the clamp on both sides. And with that, the laser is also up and running again. And in case you are wondering, I kept lifting this half-ton machine higher and higher as the water kept rising during the flood, and that ended up saving it. That alone took a full day just to get it back down safely onto the ground, but totally worth it. This awesome tool trolley was actually a Christmas present from my wife. She's been wanting to get me one of these for years now, and this was the ideal opportunity for it. I would like to start using it as is for a bit just to see how things flow, but this is kind of what I have in mind for it. So the top row I want to use for anything CNC related, the second row for all my laser stuff, and then the third row for hand tools, things like chisels and screwdrivers and stuff like that. The fourth one is a little bit bigger, and that one will have things like stationery, packaging, power cords, anything like that. And then the fifth one will be for more bulkier items that I don't use all the time. The top has a nice wood finish for an additional workbench, and it has wheels to make it really easy to move out of the way if I ever need to use the roller doors behind it. Back to the shelving units, and one thing I do want to change here is adding sheets of ply to each shelf, which will eliminate small things from falling through the holes, plus it just looks much nicer. On the workbench side, I will do the same, but at this stage only for the top shelf below the workbench. The bottom shelf I will use for larger items like storing timber and just tools and things that I don't use that often. The tools on the right hand side are all temporary, as I will be building dedicated storage solutions for those shortly, and that will free up that space as well. So make sure you subscribe for those upcoming videos. One thing I am going to try is to keep less stock on hand. This shelving unit is meant to only carry materials for the next 2 or 3 jobs, which means I will need to be much more organized when it comes to ordering new stock. But just having less clutter here already does wonders for my OCD. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this is not a renovation that I actually planned on doing just yet. Overall, it took me just over a month to get all of this done, as I also had other things that I needed to tend to. So the big question now is, how much money did I actually end up spending so far? Well, at the moment, I'm standing at $9,500. And the biggest chunk of that went towards this dust collector, which I reckon is going to be a big benefit to my health as well as keeping my shop clean or cleaner. The rest of that money quickly disappears when you start adding things up, like the new shelving units, the ply sheets that goes on the shelf, plus the torsion box that I needed to rebuild, the extraction fans for the CO2 laser, paint for the floors, lights, and a few tools and things that I had to replace. Overall, I think this is a huge improvement from what it used to be. But I am curious though, what would you have done differently to make this even better? Feel free to comment down below and I'll see you on the next one.